Hello, this is Hamilcar131. Welcome to this video, which is a brief primer on defensive layers in Grim Dawn. We're going to be talking about 5 main categories today. The first is core resistances, physical resistance, and armor. The second is defensive ability and dodge/deflect. The third is health and sustain. Fourth is damage reduction and damage absorption. And fifth is crowd control resistances, circuit breakers, emergency skills, and cleanses. There are 2 points that I'm going to make before we move on to our first category. The first point is that not every build is going to have all of these different layers of defense. The important thing to understand here is what the layers of defense are, and if you don't have one of them, to be able to think about how you can play around not having that and mitigate that weakness. The second point is that overlapping layers of defense like this are going to be more important on hardcore than on softcore. You still don't want to die on softcore, but you can get away with a little bit more, and you can take a few more chances than you would be able to do on hardcore. Alright, with that said, let's get into our first category. The first category of defenses we are going to discuss is resistances and armor. Your core resistances, which are found on the first page of your character sheet, should be at 80% at all times on Ultimate. By the time you get into Endgame, which typically means level 94 gear and the relevant augments and components that you're going to put on that gear, you'll want to have resistances overcapped by 40% to deal with enemy resist reduction. This is going to become less important in patch 1.2, but you're still probably going to want to have at least some overcap. The game is typically balanced around having 80% max all resistances, except for physical resistance, which is harder to come by. You do have the option on some amulets of getting maximum all resistances, which will act as a further form of damage reduction. 3% max all resistances means that you take 15% less damage from all sources except physical. 4% maximum all resistances means you take 20% less damage from all sources except physical. These are very powerful. They're not necessary, but they can be nice to have. Physical resistance is almost never going to get to 80% without serious power creep features in mods or without sacrificing a lot to get there. As far as armor is concerned, more armor is better than less armor, but stacking percent armor is mostly useful on high armor builds. You don't want to put too much effort into getting armor because at some point you're going to have diminishing marginal returns if you don't have a very high armor value to begin with, but it is still a good stat to have. Armor absorption is the one that you want to get as close to 100% as possible. If you're going to face tank at all, it should be 100%. This is pretty much non-negotiable because armor absorption determines how effective your armor is. There's very little value in having armor and not having armor absorption pretty close to max. If you're a caster, you might be able to get away with 92% armor absorption, but any sort of build that's going to be face tanked, again, get your armor absorption up to 100%. Our second category is defensive ability and dodge/deflect. Not all builds have meaningful dodge and deflect stats, so defensive ability is the more universally applicable one. Defensive ability is compared to the attacking monster's offensive ability, and this is used to determine your chance of being hit, and if you are hit, your chance of being crit. So defensive ability is important because it reduces these, but it's not something that you want to sacrifice too much to get excessive amounts of because there are sharply diminishing marginal returns. 2800 is a fair number to strive for on endgame builds. If you're not going to do endgame content like Celestials and Shattered Realm 50+, you can probably get away with closer to 2500, and you will still be fine. When we talk about defensive ability, we also need to factor in offensive ability shred that you might have. So if you have minus 100 offensive ability to your enemies, you can get away with 2700 defensive ability because you add the 100 to the 2700 to get 2800 effective defensive ability. Important to note that if it says reduced, it doesn't stack with other types of that offensive ability shred. This is pretty much a constant rule in all of Grim Dawn. If it says minus offensive ability, it does stack. Keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that offensive ability shred that doesn't have 100% uptime is going to be less effective, and you really want to mostly look at anything that has 100% uptime when you're calculating your effective defensive ability. Beyond that, we also have dodge and deflect. Not all builds are going to have meaningful amounts of this. You can get it from certain mastery skills, from gear, from devotions. I would say if you have less than 15% of either, it's not going to be really worth factoring in that much. If you have at least 15%, then that does mean that 15% of the time a projectile doesn't hit you for deflect, or 15% of the time a melee attack doesn't hit you for dodge. This is useful. This also stacks with the defensive ability in terms of if you have 20% dodge and your defensive ability gives you only an 80% chance of being hit, then you have a 64% chance now of being hit because you have 0.8 times 0.8 gets you to 64%. So it is useful to understand how those stack multiplicatively, but again, a lot of builds aren't going to have that much dodge and deflect. They're nice to have, but they're not critical. But at the same time, if you can get some, get some. If you don't have to sacrifice too much. Same as defensive ability, really. Our third category is health and sustain. You need enough health to survive a critical hit from the hardest hitting enemy that you plan to fight, and ideally you need enough health that you can survive that crit even if you weren't at 100% health when it happened. 15,000 is a fair minimum for hardcore. In an ideal world, you're going to want more, but I'm not going to tell you that a build is unviable if you only have 15,000. There are even some people who play builds with less health than that. I don't recommend it unless you really know what you're doing and are prepared for the consequences of having low health. If you can get more than 15,000, great. There are some classes where getting 20,000 is not that difficult, and with health, generally speaking, it is the more the merrier. So get more health if you can reasonably afford it, and you're not sacrificing too much to get it. Next up is sustain, which pairs with health. The idea of sustain is that you need enough sustain that you heal back to full health before you take your next big hit. Sustain comes in two flavors. You have health regeneration and healing abilities. Dryad being a key healing devotion for a lot of casters, for example. And you also have attack damage converted to health or life leech. Generally speaking, auto attack and weapon damage based builds are going to focus more on life leech. Casters are going to focus more on health regeneration and healing. There are exceptions to that rule. A lot of builds will successfully combine both. Exactly how much you need is a sort of thing I recommend that you really go by feel and see, are you comfortable with how quickly you're healing and regenerating your health after you take big hits? If you're not, then maybe look into getting more. And if you are, then start focusing on other layers of defense that will also be useful. Our fourth category is damage reduction and damage absorption. Damage reduction comes first. It's a debuff to enemies that reduces the amount of damage they deal. You have to apply it for enemies for it to work. And like anything else that says reduced, you cannot stack multiple iterations of reduced target's damage. Only the highest value will apply. After damage reduction, you get percent damage absorption. This reduces damage from all attacks by the same percent. It stacks multiplicatively, so two sources of 20% damage absorption mean you have 36% damage absorption. So an attack that would do 10,000 damage with those two sources of percentage absorption is only going to do 6,400 damage, meaning that it saves 3,600. Incidentally, practically speaking, this is kind of how damage reduction and damage absorption work in conjunction. If you reduce target's damage by 20%, then that 10,000 becomes 8,000. If you have 20% absorption, that 8,000 becomes 6,400. There are some instances where it matters to understand the order, but for most practical purposes, you can assume that these are going to sort of stack multiplicatively. Flat absorption is a different animal. Flat absorption reduces damage from all attacks by a constant amount and also comes at the end of this cycle. So flat absorption applies after your damage reduction, after your damage absorption, after your resists, which is why the comparatively smaller values that you see with flat absorption are actually incredibly powerful. Generally speaking, percentage absorption is better against single large attacks. Flat absorption is better against smaller attacks and damage over time. But ideally, you're going to have both, and you're going to learn how to play with each. Our fifth and final category is a sort of catch-all for things that haven't been discussed yet. It includes crowd control resistances, circuit breakers, panic buttons, and cleanses. Crowd control resistances protect you against being stunned, frozen, petrified, trapped, or slowed. None of these things are good. All of them you want to avoid and have 80% resistance against if you possibly can. If you don't, you need to be aware that you don't and have a contingency plan for when bad things happen, because they are very easy ways to get yourself killed. They're also very easy to overlook. Circuit breakers proc at a set percentage of health and provide defensive benefits, heals, and other boosts to survivability. There are kind of two circuit breaker types. One is a extreme circuit breaker, which procs at low health and has a very high cooldown, something like Serenity. The other is something that procs at 50% or more health and has a lower cooldown, and you can actually use tactically. Examples include Turtle and Blast Shield. As far as panic buttons are concerned, there are two mastery-specific Mirror of Arioctis and Blade Barrier. Both give you 100% damage absorption. The Arcanist version Mirror is much better because it doesn't immobilize you. The last panic button is an Aether Cluster, which has a long cooldown, but gives you 75% damage absorption for 8 seconds. You should always, under all circumstances, have Aether Clusters on your hotbar. There is no excuse not to do this unless you want your character to die. Assuming you want to live, have Aether Clusters, and it's better to use a cluster than save it for the next character. Finally, cleanses. Nullification from the Arcanist Mastery Tree and the Ulo Devotion proc are the main ones that come to mind. They cleanse all debuffs that are currently on your character. That includes any sort of damage over time that your character is taking, as well as anything else that is adversely affecting you. This is very, very powerful. Not all characters are going to have nullification or be able to get to Ulo on the Devotion Tree, but if you can, this is definitely something that you want to be able to take advantage of. Wrapping up, a few key takeaways. 1. Always plan defensive layers when you're theory crafting. Don't just look at damaging abilities and your character's total damage. You also want to look at whether your character can stay alive. 2. Not every character is going to be able to have all of these defensive layers, or if they do, they're not always going to be equally effective. That's fine, but that is something you need to be aware of. 3. Be aware of your character's weaknesses. Be aware of content your characters shouldn't do, and have a contingency plan to deal with those weaknesses, because at some point when you're playing this game, they are going to show up.